Next up, we're going to do the 12th President of the United States, Zachary Taylor. Again, 5 criteria are growth, finances, international politics, war and security, and most importantly, did they leave the country better or worse than when they found it? Dealing with the first elephant in the room with Zachary Taylor, he died 16 months into office, so he didn't even fulfill a full term, little over a quarter of a term. But I think he came in at a time that was a lot of things going on. I think his year in office had a lot that happened. So I think we can have a more full discussion of his presidency than we did with William Henry Harrison. We're really just talking about a month where he was in office, really only 3 decisions in total that he had that were of any real significance. A lot of things were decided under Taylor, and Taylor did a lot during his time. Talking about growth, when he comes in, he has to make a lot of decisions almost immediately because Polk has left office shortly after the end of the Mexican-American War, with this huge amount of territory that we have to decide what are we going to do with this territory. And I think a lot of the election going in was the discussion of what are we going to do with this territory. There was a lot of discussion of the slavery issue. In fact, I believe this was in Martin Buren ran an entire Free Soil Party discussing that we should be making this land free, and this is an opportunity for us to finally end slavery. Taylor was a slave owner, and I think he had a lot of support coming from places that he wouldn't have gotten support from before, running as a Whig. Jacksonians generally were the Democrats, the Jacksonian Democrats, because he was a slave owner. And I think slave owners thought that he'd be more sympathetic to their cause, even though he was a Whig. And I think he kind of got to navigate the middle ground there, where he got support in the North because he was a Whig, or at least on the Northeast. But he also was seen by the Southerners as someone that they could live with because he was a slave owner and he thought to be sympathetic. He was the last slave owner to be president. He was not as sympathetic as the Southerners thought he would be. He came in, and I think the way I would describe Taylor from what I've read about him is he just wanted things to be calm. He wanted to bring the temperature down on all of these issues while also making clear that if there was going to be threats to secession, if there were going to be threats to destabilization, he wasn't going to take that. He was a military man. He wanted stability, kind of like Washington in that way. Again, we're not saying Zachary Taylor was George Washington. Trust me, we're not going to end up there. But I think the military mindset of someone who's like, I want things to be calm and stable, and if they're not, I will use force. And I think that was how Taylor approached a lot of things. So in terms of growth, when Texas was threatening to send militia in to occupy areas so they could take additional claim to areas of New Mexico, Taylor said, "I will send federal troops and I will regulate. I will take care of this. You want to fight? We can have that fight." And I think his being a military person and that threat being viable helped stabilize that. I think in a lot of the secession talks, when the Southerners were making threats of leaving the Union or over the free states, when they were getting upset and demanding that slavery exists in the new territories, he made clear he's not going to cater to threats. He said, if somebody puts on my desk something saying that there's no slavery in the new territories, I will sign it. And I think is his way of saying, we're not having this fight. We're not going to have these arguments. I'm not going to cater to this. And I think there's a curious counter question if he had stayed in office, if things could have been worked out in a way that either, possibly in a negative way where we're kicking the can down the line and we don't have the Civil War happen in the next 10 to 15 years, or if something could have been worked out where it would have been slowly phased out and over time something can work out. Again, he's a slave owner. He's not opposed to slavery. He doesn't have a moral qualm with it. But I think everyone was surprised at his approach, that he was willing to say, we need to figure out a solution so we can all work together. We're not going to separate. And I think that was a positive, but I'm not going to give him much credit for growth because, again, 16 months, and it wasn't like it was a growth thing. It was more of a stabilization thing. In terms of finances, he disappointed the Whigs. The Whigs were a party that was running on bringing back the national banking system and getting rid of the independent treasury, to have a national bank, and also to have protective tariffs put in place to protect northern industry. And he was opposed to both of those things. He wasn't running as a Whig because he believed in the Whig ideology on finance. He was running as a Whig because he was opposed to a lot of the ideas of manifest destiny and Jacksonian ideology. So I would say he was probably neutral. I don't disagree with his stance, and I think at that point bringing back a national bank didn't make a lot of sense, even if you think it would have been a good idea. The country was also doing much better because of the California gold rush and because of the expansion. We had all this new land, and so I think I would put him as neutral, but he certainly wasn't someone who did a lot of new things on finance or created a lot of new opportunities. Again, fairly neutral. In terms of international politics, one of the things he's probably best known for is negotiating the treaties that kind of set the framework for when they eventually built the Panama Canal. I think at the time they were looking more in Nicaragua, but the idea that we were going to build a canal and it was going to be an international canal, that we weren't just going to go down and take the land and occupy the land and basically make Central America America and have all these wars. Part of the fear of manifestation that people didn't like it is like we keep having all these expansions and it destabilizes everything, and then we're going to have all these wars. Are we going to take over Mexico, or where do we draw the line? And there were a lot of people who were pushing for us to invade Cuba, or at least destabilize Cuba and make Cuba the another state, so we'd have another slave state. A lot of people in the South really were in favor of making Cuba a state because Cuba was one of the few places left where slavery was still legal. And a lot of people in the South were not just in favor of maintaining the process of slavery. They thought slavery was appropriate and good and should be expanded. I think there's this entire misunderstanding of the philosophy of a lot of the South, where they were like, they just wanted to keep their place and do things that they always done. They wanted to expand slavery. They thought slavery was good. They thought white supremacy was natural and good, and anyone opposed to it was opposed to the nature of the world, and they wanted to expand slavery wherever they could, including into the North. And they were very angry that the North was not going to enforce the fugitive slave laws, and they were, very, very upset at Taylor for not making them enforce it. And that was one of the reasons that Taylor was like, enough. If you really believe in freedom, that people can do what they want in their own areas, you have to accept that the North does not agree with slavery and does not want to send slaves back and doesn't want your slave catchers coming up here and running around and trying to enforce law in states where they don't belong. So all of that international politics, I would say, fairly positive. I'm not going to say like one of the great international scholars of all time, but I think he was someone who was looking for peaceful solutions, for cooperation, for us to work together, that it didn't have to be the my way or the highway or starting conflicts that were unnecessary. In terms of war security, again, we could have very easily been pulled into conflicts where there could have been a secession crisis, where the Texas militia could have had a little bleeding Kansas situation happen in New Mexico. Didn't happen. Could have had a conflict, honestly, with Utah. At this point, the Mormons had moved into Utah before the Mexican-American War and occupied all this land out in Deseret. They were calling it. This is before it was Utah. This is back when they were trying to set up Deseret territory. That could have become a conflict. It did become a conflict later. We'll get to the Utah wars. And he more took the approach of like, live and let live. You guys are out there. There was actually talk for a while that Utah might be pulled into California. He kept that separate and kind of divided things so that they would be able to live autonomously away without being under state control and kind of live how they wanted to live. I think Taylor was more of a, look, I don't want to fight. I don't want to conflict. I want to de-escalate. I want to just let things be as they are. And I think that was a lot of his mindset on a lot of things. Some people say to a negative detriment. Some people say he wasn't working with Congress enough. Nobody knew what he was doing. He kind of went on his own way. But I think probably at this time that was not a bad course of action because there were so many ambitious people who were trying to force agendas. God knows John Calhoun was trying to pick a fight. And, Henry Clay also was trying to pick a fight on the banking things. You call him the great compromiser because he worked out, things later. But I think you have to understand the ambitions of all these men. And the compromise of 1850, even though it didn't happen on his watch, I think it was kind of because of the way he was pushing things that it did eventually happen. So in terms of better or worse, 16 months isn't enough time. I'm very curious, and I wish we had a counter history where we could figure out what would happen if he got a full term or even 2 terms, and how things would have been fundamentally different. Whether this strategy would have worked or whether the strategy would have just accelerated the war, and eventually him being so, we're not going to decide these things, or being willing to sign off on things that would really upset the South would have accelerated the war, or possibly would it have delayed it, possibly could have de-escalated it. We'll never know. But what I can say is, looking at the list, I'm going to put him ahead of Jackson because he didn't leave the country in a complete dire strait financially and heading toward a death spiral to the Civil War. So that puts him at number 8. So Zachary Taylor, number 8. And to finish this off, let's continue something we discussed about with William Henry Harrison. Taylor is one of the 2 Whig presidents who died in office after less than 2 years. But what I think people don't always realize is, yes, Harrison died in office of a stomach disease. Polk actually died just after leaving office of a stomach disease. And then Taylor dies in office of a stomach disease. It means 3 out of the 4 presidents in that cycle get sick from a stomach disease and die either in office or shortly after leaving office. Tyler was famously not in Washington that much and hated being in Washington, was in and out a lot. Again, the Washington sewer system was upstream from the White House water supply until this time. I believe it was Millard Fillmore, whereas the first president, where they moved the White House water either to I don't remember if they moved the White House water so it was no longer downstream from the Washington sewage system. History is quite awkward.